I want to talk less technically, more anecdotally, more organizationally about my experience. So I'm a UI engineer. I work at a chaos engineering startup. What I want to talk about is how game days have been a really interesting experience for me. It's changed my perception of chaos engineering and of, more generally speaking, of failure. I think it's essentially what I'd like to convince you of is the fact that including people like me is really good for everyone in your organization when you are looking to think about failure and perhaps run game days in the future. Okay, who am I? Patrick Higgins. My handle's Higgy Codes. And as has been mentioned, I'm a UI engineer from Gremlin. What is Gremlin? As we've previously said, we're a chaos engineering startup. Essentially, our tagline, if you want our company's mission in a phrase, it would be resilience as a service. So much like Ted and Nora, we're actually aiming for more than just chaos engineering. We're actually looking for resiliency in general. I'm originally from Sydney, Australia. I lived in Utah for a little while and now live actually just down the road, which is kind of cool. So, any World Cup fans here? Yeah. Cool. Any Mexico fans here? Congratulations, that's fantastic. Any Germany fans here? All right, cool. Safe space. That's good. So, regardless of what you thought about Slack this morning, I would have to say that Germany was actually the biggest failure of the day. It's personal preference, but you may or may not agree. So what I really want to talk about is particularly my experience as a new employee at Gremlin, because I came to Gremlin not knowing much about chaos engineering, and I would posit to say that most UI engineers would not know much about chaos engineering, and I'd like to assert that we don't really think about failure that well either. So when I joined the company, I wanted to ship a lot of features. I was actually the first UI engineer to join Gremlin, which was an amazing experience. I had a lot of features to ship. We had our first iteration of support for containers to do. I had to create a metrics dashboard for attacks. So there's a lot of stuff to get out the door. And then a couple of months in, we started this process of what we call dogfooding. I didn't know what this was at the time, but essentially it's the process of using your product on yourselves. Some people like to call it tasting your own champagne. I think it's bizarre that the analogy that makes your product sound the worst and the analogy that makes your product sound the best, and there's like absolutely no middle ground there. But I digress. In our case, it meant introducing failure into our own system. And we called this process Failure Fridays. So what I started to realize really quickly was that Failure Fridays was essentially a game day, a chaos engineering game day. What does that mean? It means dedicated time for teams to collaboratively focus on using chaos engineering practices to reveal weaknesses in your services or systems. So when we were running these game days, we were setting hypotheses regarding potential outcomes that we'd see from the experiments we were running. We'd map out our system architecture. We'd pick very small localized points that we could fail, and we would iterate on the scope and the effect of the attacks that we were running. I'd like to say that my UI features, all these UI features that I'd been pushing out the door, that they all were incredibly resilient and the user experience was exceptional, but it was not the case at all. I'd find that I'd get hung up on loading states. There wouldn't be good enough error messaging. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is that the user experience was quite poor. And this got me really thinking. I sat down. I was a little bit, taken aback. I filed a lot of bug tickets, and essentially over the next couple of weeks was able to gradually knock out all these problems that I'd seen from the user experience from the game days we'd been running. And it got me thinking about remediation generally. What could I, as a UI engineer, do to essentially do a better job of creating a product that would be more resilient to conditions in which our systems were under duress? That was essentially the question that came to mind. And what I started to realize was that Failure Fridays had become a forcing function for me. I was beginning to uncover brittleness in the UI, and I was also beginning to understand our system at a deeper level. It was an incredibly educational experience. So essentially what I'd like to point out today is that everyone benefits from observing a failure, even UI engineers, people from a UX background, product managers. If we all get involved, it encourages cross-organization collaboration. You find champions in the company that might come from areas that you didn't expect, and it encourages varied perspectives. So I want to talk about failure from a UI perspective now. So I'm just using Twitter examples purely because basically everyone knows Twitter, and is pretty. If you're anything like me, you're pretty. It's a pretty well-used interface at this point. So what I'd like to point out is that say the tweets, the following, and the tweets, the following, and the followers service has essentially failed. From a UI perspective, we could end up with the profile card that you see at the bottom half of the slide there, or that data could be omitted in its entirety. And through this omission, you might find that the user doesn't actually notice that anything's failed at all. In this particular context, that data is auxiliary data. It's data that is supplementary to the user's goal on this particular page, which is to look through their tweets. So what comes to mind is the fact that we have essentially, in the UI, we have different types of functionality and different types of data. It might be primary to the user's goal on that particular page, or it could be something that's supplementary and adds to that experience. So, not picking on Slack, but I want to sort of commend them on a really good user experience here. I'd also like to point out that in my Slack channels, it's a mix of Tim Tams and soccer. That's basically all that goes on between me and our CFO, Daryl. But in this perspective, you can see some things that, from a UX perspective, really help. For a start, this is the Electron app, but if the Electron app is disconnected, the input down the bottom is disabled straight away, so I can't send off messages into the ether. Additionally, you can see on the green column section that you have on the left-hand side, just having the styling there that mimics the channels that you'd otherwise have means it doesn't feel broken. Like the page, the styling still feels like it's contextualized. So it's great that they've really thought through that element of the site too, the styling here. And you can see that Slack is telling me that they're going to try to reconnect in, at this point, 4 seconds, or I have the option to retry now. So all in all, like holistically, I'd like to say that Slack in this particular instance, like this is I took this screenshot this morning. It's probably a pretty common experience across the board here, but this UX experience was thought through. And that might not seem like a lot, but it's actually, I would like to posit from a UI perspective, it's more rare than you'd actually expect. So what does this mean for UI in general? I would like to posit that UI engineering can benefit a lot from being included in these conversations about failure generally. End-to-end testing or mocking of services is not really enough. And the reason I'd like to say that is because at that point, you're really validating something. It's not about discovery. From my perspective, from my experience, the things that have been really exciting about game days generally, it's that element of discovery. I've found things that I wouldn't otherwise find. And that can, you can find things in testing as well, but for me, personally, having that primary motivation of discovery has been incredibly useful. The open source tooling around failure mitigation in UI is, I would like to say it's underdeveloped. I think there's a lot we can do to include better consideration of failure in UI development. And tooling's regularly company specific. As you can see from today, like the tools that LinkedIn have in terms of being able to inject failure from a Chrome extension, that kind of tooling is something that I hope one day we can see across the board. It's phenomenal. So those opportunities, obviously the chaos engineering is like a real burgeoning field, and the opportunities to think about how that interacts and can and intersects with UI is something that I'm really excited about. Equally, from a product perspective, depending on which company you're at, I would say that mapping out of alternative states is something that doesn't really happen that much. That's not a conversation that's, in my experience, anecdotally, it hasn't been something that I've seen a lot. And I don't think, it's really rare to get product specs that include a comprehensive idea about what user experience for failure scenarios should actually look like. So I'd like to leave you with just a couple of resources, things that I've found to be super cool, very useful. The first one is this particular GitHub repo is just stacked with incredible resources for chaos engineering. Secondly, I'd like to point you to this list of resources that Gremlin's actually made available. It might help to codify how, or at least point people in the right direction for how they can actually do game days by themselves. We've also got a chaos community Slack. It's a really active, and I think it's a really excellent place for us to bounce ideas off each other. I personally have learned a lot from engaging in this particular Slack. So this is just a redirect link, but it's not directly affiliated with Gremlin, and that's super useful. So I want to say thanks. It's been really fun, and I'm really excited to see where everyone goes with chaos engineering as it picks up steam. Cheers.